Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. I am delighted to welcome here today Dr. Jennifer Jenkins, who is Chief Science Officer at Rubicon Carbon, which is a company that uses a team of scientists and investors to drive market-driven solutions to fight climate change through carbon dioxide removal. I think there are few, if any, others who are so well equipped for this sort of position as Jen. She comes with a wealth of academic training in biology as an undergraduate at Dartmouth, with a Master of Forest Science from Yale School for the Environment, which was then School for the Environment and Forestry, or Forestry and the Environment, and a PhD in ecosystem ecology from the University of New Hampshire. She then worked in government in two different ways. First with the U.S. Forest Service, working on their forest inventory program, which is really tracking how you account for carbon gain and loss within forests across large regions. And she also worked for the US EPA in developing much of the US greenhouse gas inventory procedures that contributed to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that went on to win the Nobel Peace Prize. So indeed, she is a Nobel Peace Prize winner. Between those two stints, she worked in academia as a research professor at the University of Vermont, leading efforts on forest biogeochemistry, and where she also founded the Forest Carbon Dynamics Lab, and was also tapped by the Vermont governor to serve in several advisory capacities for the state of Vermont on climate change. I believe, or I understand, Jen is also really impatient about trying to get things done at the pace of change coming from both academics and in academia to try and confront the climate challenge. And for that, she realized that a lot is happening in the private sector. She went and got an executive MBA from the University of Maryland, and since then has worked for several companies focusing on carbon management before taking the reins at Rubicon. So we're going to hear about some of the reality of the carbon markets from Jen. Take it away, please.
Okay, thank you. That was a nice introduction. Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. But all of that is good. One of my most important roles, though, is as mom. And I do have another connection to Cornell. I have a sophomore in the environmental and sustainability major. So Caroline, shout out to Caroline, who I'm sure would love to raise her hand. She's here in the audience. So yeah, thank you so much for that. And thank you for having me here. It's really my pleasure, my honor to be here talking to you today. I hope by the end of this talk, I want you to understand how companies are meeting the net zero challenge. And I want you to understand how the voluntary carbon market can help. Okay, and so those are my two. I want you to let's make sure that we sort of address both of those things, because that's why I'm here today. That's what I want to talk about. And so here is like a structure. Here's what the talk is going to be, right? So we're going to first talk about what is the challenge? What is this thing, net zero? What does that even mean, right? How are companies addressing it, right? And Christy mentioned that I've done a lot of work in government and academia. I'm really going to focus today on companies because the private sector is where I am right now. And I actually strongly believe that if we are going to fix this climate challenge and solve the climate crisis, the private sector absolutely has to step up to the table. And they are, right? And so I want to talk about that. So how are companies addressing the challenge? I want to talk about the voluntary carbon market, just kind of introduce you to it. Hello, VCM. Hello, Cornell. And then, what is the VCM doing to sort of meet this moment? Many of you have probably heard that the voluntary carbon market is sort of on thin ice a little bit. And I'm here to tell you a little bit about how we're making that ice a little bit thicker, right? We're standing on more solid ground, starting really in 2024. This is an important inflection year for the VCM. And then if we have time, I'll tell you a little bit about my company, Rubicon Carbon. So it is the challenge, okay? Here's what we're gonna talk about. Yeah, emissions. Those of you who's studying climate change in school, just like a quick raise of hands. Okay, who is this seminar has been like your first intro to climate stuff? Okay, so a few of you, not many, okay. But you probably know, right, that emissions are at an all-time high. Yeah, they're at all-time high. We haven't really changed emissions since 2015. And so, yeah, a lot of these slides, by the way, are going to come from, there's a guy, Nathaniel Bullard, who does a fantastic, it's like a 300 slide deck that he does every year. And he released it this year in January. Highly recommend. The URL for it is at the bottom of the slides. Okay, so there's a source and also the URL. So for the ones I got, the ones I swiped from Nate are going to have the Nathaniel Bullard thing at the bottom. I just want to make sure I attribute that. You don't think I made these myself. When I made the slides myself, I'll be sure to tell you, this is not one of them. So yeah, fossil fuel emissions are still at an all-time high. We've been working on this problem for a while, but we're still sort of not really making a lot of progress. And we're seeing now that there are impacts. We're seeing the impact of the sort of cumulative burden of atmospheric greenhouse gases, right? We see that now. And what we're seeing is, yeah, we've got, last year was probably the warmest 12 months in about 125,000 years, right? So this is a graph of temperature change, average global temperature. It's going up. You'll note we're at 1.48 degrees Celsius, dangerously close to 1.5, okay? Which is kind of where IPCC says, wow, like we're okay if we get to 1.5, but if we get beyond that, we're kind of not really sure what's going to happen, okay? So we're pretty close. I'm not here to make you, but I also recognize that that can sometimes make people feel depressed. And so I'm gonna end my talk with all the things we're doing about it and all the ways we can fix. So yeah, and the other thing that's happening is temperatures are spiking in the ocean. I think that's really, really interesting because the ocean has a giant heat capacity, and a lot of the heat that is being sort of accumulating in the atmosphere is actually being transmitted and transferred into the ocean, which is a huge sort of sink for heat. And so we are seeing in 2023, this is probably the most, this curve that shows temperature change in the ocean, right? And this red line is what ocean temperatures looked like in 2023. So they exceeded the record that had originally been set in March 2016. So temperatures in the ocean are really sort of unusually high. And this is causing scientists to really sort of begin wondering, what does that mean, right? What does that mean for, circulation in the ocean and sort of the rest of atmospheric temperature and the feedbacks, right, that we know exist, especially with things like sea level rise and sort of glacier, loss of sea ice. Well, if we translate this into, what does this mean for humans and for societies? This is what governments care about, right? So this is like the number of weather-related disasters that cost people $1 billion or more, right? So we're seeing a lot of, my point is to paint not a depressingly horrifying picture, but like an alarmist. Yes, we should be alarmed. We should pay attention. And I think this is pretty interesting because this, as I said, this is what people and governments are really paying attention to. This is what the insurance companies are looking at when they decide whether or not they're going to allow a homeowner in Florida, for example, to take out insurance, right? A lot of insurance companies are sort of getting out of the especially sort of tricky markets because it's hard and they don't feel like they can take on the risk of these sort of weather-related disasters. All right, so how are we doing? So I've talked about emissions are an all-time high. I've talked about the measurable effects of the overall accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Now I'm going to talk about what are we doing about it? Okay, what are governments doing about it? And really, this is probably, hopefully you can see this. It's a little small up there. But this is do I have a point? I do have a pointer. Maybe I do. Anyway, we'll point to it here. I'm going to come out here. So this is a graph of like, what do we need to do as a global society in order to reach, in order to sort of keep temperatures to, 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. And so you probably know in the Paris Agreement, which was agreed in 2015, all of the countries in the world, which are parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is all the countries in the world, okay, agreed that they would each say, they would each contribute some amount of reductions to the global effort to reduce emissions. And each country got to decide how much it thought it could, given its national circumstances, how much it thought it could contribute to that global effort. And each one of those countries then submitted what it calls a nationally determined contribution, or an NDC. Okay, and so what this is it's saying, so this started in 2015, and it said, all right, here we are in 2015, if we sort of get to 2020, and then we can make some projections about what the emissions need to look like in declining in order to get down to a 1.5 degree or a 2 degree world. So that's what these green and yellow and blue lines are, right? That's the range we can be at if we're gonna sort of keep temperatures to that level. And then they said, okay, so now let's look at the NDCs that each country contributed as part of the Paris Agreement. And we can say, all right, so some of the NDCs are what they call unconditional, and that means this country will do this thing to reduce emissions no matter what anybody else does. Okay, that's my commitment to you, no matter what anybody else does. I don't care what you do. Here's what I'm going to do, right? And then some of the countries had what's called or some of the countries might have had both. And then they had a conditional NDC, and they said, all right, China, if you do this, then I'll do that, right? Or if you do this, right? So those are conditional, right? They have some condition on them. And so the unconditional NDCs are obviously, they're in that orange line, right? So the blue line is like, okay, if we all just kept doing what we want to do, it's going to be the blue line, the current policy scenario. Okay, that's the blue line. And then yellow is like, all right, unconditional. If nobody else does anything, here's what I think I can do, right? And then the red dot is, here are the conditional ones. These are like, if you do this, then I do that. That's more conditional, okay? But the key thing to know is that it's pretty obvious, right? In no case are we actually getting down to those green or blue dots, which is where we need to be in order to keep emissions and temperatures down to 1.5 or 2 degrees above historical norms. Okay, so this is what governments are, this is the government NDCs. And, there is hope, I think in COP28, which was the meeting that just happened in Dubai last year, there was an agreement among all of the countries that they would it wasn't phase out, it was phase down fossil fuels, which is actually, believe it or not, that is actually a strong statement, especially coming from, an entity especially coming from a meeting that was happening in the United Arab Emirates, which is an oil sort of producing country, right, where oil is the main source of income. So that was actually it doesn't sound like it, but it was actually a pretty big statement for them to make. This was from a few years ago. So we're hoping that the NDCs are a little bit better than they were. Still, you can see, I said, look, emissions are still where they were in 2015. Even though in the EU and the US, emissions have gone down, you can see they've gone up in other parts of the world, okay? So this is the conundrum in global climate change mitigation right now, is how do you sort of leapfrog over the fossil intensive phase of development for some of the least advantaged countries, right? In order to have what they call a just transition and a just sort of development, okay? We've talked a little bit about what governments are doing, how they're trying to sort of make this work. Right, what is net zero? Is this a term you guys have heard before? Yeah, some of you have heard it before. Okay, so here's the thing. Global greenhouse gas emissions are long-lived. So they hang out in the atmosphere for hundreds of years after they're emitted. Okay, so if we as a society are going to have a planet that doesn't just keep warming, we need to find a way to balance those emissions, right? In other words, every emission that occurs needs to be balanced by a removal. Okay, in other words, net emissions as a global society will be zero when we are at the state of what's called net zero, right? So what the IPCC says is that in order for us to sort of maintain a planet, right, at 1.5 degrees above where we, historical norms, what we're aiming to do as a society is reach net zero by 2050. right? And again, that means that every emission in 2050 needs to be balanced by a comparable removal. Okay, so that over the long term, there's no net additions of greenhouse gas to the atmosphere. That's the state of net zero. That's what that means, okay? And so the IPCC, when they're thinking about breaking down, or thinking about how do we get there, the IPCC's job is to sort of model these various pathways. And so they envision, like, let's think of a world where all of the electricity is renewable and all of the manufacturing is, has zero emissions, and concrete emissions are somehow, gotten down to zero. And so there's only a few like small residual emissions that are left. We've been able to sort of squeeze all the emissions out of all the little sort of sneaky places where emissions happen. And then we've got removals down here at the very tail end, down below the horizontal line. We only need a few removals. That's this scenario here, P1. Okay, and then and then they have sort of various levels of ambition around the decarbonization in industry and other human effects, right? And sort of, at the least ambitious down here all the way at the right is when we need a lot of removals because we've really done a lot of emitting along the way. Okay, so does this make sense? Kind of have like a nod or like I have no idea what you're talking about. Okay, yeah.
Explain that AFOLU.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. So AFOLU stands for Agriculture, Forestry, and Other Land Use, AFOLU. So that's like in the ag sector, in forestry and land use, we're actually we're going to grow more trees, or we're going to store carbon in the soil in the ag sector. So those are removals. And then BECCS stands for Bioenergy with Carbon Capture and Storage. So that's this yellow wedge, right? And you can see all the way on the right, we're really relying heavily on a lot of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage to make what they call negative emissions electricity. Largely theoretical, right? I don't know that I'm not sure we've mapped out how we're going to actually get to that level of BECCS. Some BECCS, I think, in P2 is probable. That's a lot of BECCS. BECCS right now is really expensive. Yeah. Okay. So that's what's net zero. Okay. So then, like we say, okay, so that's like at the global level, and that's IPCC, which is the sort of global network of scientists who are impaneled to advise the UN Framework Convention on how in the world are we going to get there. Okay. So then McKinsey says, okay, great. We, as a global society, we know what it's going to take. So now let's take your individual business. Okay, so actually, your individual business is a little bit late, right? This is a trajectory for This is actually a trajectory for. This just breaking it down. Sorry, this isn't one individual business. I have the individual business one a little bit later. This is sort of let's break down a little bit with a little more resolution, right? What it's going to take in each one of these sectors to get to net zero per McKinsey. So this is McKinsey's scenario they're calling it the Network for Greening the Financial System. And they say, look, we're going to have to get down to like zero in the power sector. And this is going to be important later, right? It's relatively easy to get emissions in the electricity sector down to zero. We kind of know how to do that, right? Because we know we can do wind, we can do solar, we can do hydro, we can do geothermal. We have a lot of ways to get to zero carbon electricity. Where we have a little more trouble is like industry or mobility, right? So the shipping industry, really hard to make a zero emissions cargo ship. We don't have those yet, right? Mobility, really hard to make a zero emissions airplane, right? We don't have that yet. We have some sustainable aviation fuel, but right now the most aggressive sustainable aviation fuel targets are saying you can get to maybe 5% is like the most aggressive SAF target for an airline right now. Okay, so SAF is great, but like it's hard, okay? And so that's mobility. And industry, right? There are some very high emitted, there's hard to abate sectors, right? There's steel production, concrete, chemicals production, a lot of the manufacturing sector. These are places where, we built up hundreds of years of manufacturing capacity relying on fossil fuels, right? We're not gonna be able to just sort of squeeze all those fossil fuels out of this whole system overnight. It's gonna be difficult. And so that's why we're sort of saying, let's get to some removals. We're gonna have in these sectors, in these sort of, light blue sectors there, we're still gonna have some emissions. We'll probably need some removals to get to zero, to get to net zero. I'm not gonna talk about methane. I'm leaving the methane piece out for right now. Even the methane's important. Okay, how are we doing? You still with me? How are companies addressing this challenge? Okay, so the first thing to know, different industries, different needs, right? Every company is different. Every industry is different. That's what makes this whole thing so interesting, right? So power, right now in the power sector, the emissions in the power sector make up 30% of the overall total. Okay, so like we think of, yay, we're making a lot of progress on electricity and that's great, but let's also keep in mind the electricity is 30% of the total. And then industry, and these are some of the highest emitting, most hard to abate industries, right? Steel is a huge one. Cement production is one of the major sources of emissions globally. Oil and gas extraction, obviously, chemicals production, coal mining. Okay, and so together, those make up like 30%. Mobility, look at that, so that's road, 75%. We can do a lot with electric cars, right? But we still have aviation, we still have shipping. Buildings, residential, if you live probably most anywhere in the US, your home is heated with a furnace. It might be oil, it might be natural gas. It's rarely electricity. Sometimes it is, but rarely. Right, you're gonna have, so a lot of buildings will need to switch over, probably to electricity. That would be great because we know how to make low carbon electricity. So that's why we say electrify everything when we're trying to really make a difference on climate. And then there's agriculture and forestry, right? And so those are a little, they also need their own sort of solutions, right? But every sector needs its own bespoke solution, right? And so that's part of the story. Different industries, different needs. So what each company can do, and this is how companies do this. You're a company, you are maybe in the manufacturing sector, I used to work for a company that made wood pellets that were used as an alternative to coal in heat and power applications. And so we were thinking, okay, we want to make a net zero goal. We're going to do our best to make a net zero goal at 2030. Okay, and so we first set our long-term goal. Okay, great, a net zero long-term goal. Then we sort of set, so that the year is sort of when you decide you want to get there. Okay, then you set your science-based target. And that basically means that as a company, you are committing to reach your goal, whether with short-term actions or long-term actions. It's going to be at a pace that is consistent with what science is telling us we need to do, right, in order to reach net zero by 2050. In other words, if all of the companies in the world would set a science-based target and sort of go about their business of, gradually and incrementally reducing their emissions accordingly, then as a global society, we would reach global net zero, right? It's kind of that simple. That's the idea. It ends up being a lot more complicated than that, but that's the theory, okay? And then annually, right, the other idea is that annually the companies will disclose what they're doing, right, to hold themselves accountable to their shareholders and to their management and to the government. And the Securities and Exchange Commission just last week released its disclosure regulation that it had been sitting on and thinking about for about a year and a half, that is now requiring companies on the public exchange to report what's called their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And I'm not going to go into what that means, but it basically it's sort of to disclose how many emissions they generate in the course of doing their business. Okay, California has already made this required as part of their reporting requirements. So, this is an annual disclosure this is the first step toward requiring companies to sort of be much more transparent about what they're doing and how they're operating. So this is sort of the science-based target process. And a lot of companies are making these commitments. All right, so more than 6,000 companies have actually committed to a science-based target. Some of them are what they call net zero targets, which are a little more stringent, a little more difficult to reach. And some of them are just targets where the company is like, this is my NDC, this is my equivalent of the NDC. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to quite get to net zero, but I'm going to do everything I can. Maybe I'm in a hard to abate sector and the technology just doesn't exist yet. Or I'm not comfortable, I'm a fairly conservative company. I'm not quite comfortable making a net zero commitment just yet because I'm not quite sure I can make it. So, about half of the targets we see out there are these net zero targets. Okay, so once you as a company have gone through this process of setting your target and thinking about what it's going to take to get there, you're going to start stacking up your options. Okay, so you're going to say, all right, what are the cheapest things that I think I can do that might move the needle for me as a company in terms of my emissions? So you're going to first start with these things all the way on the left-hand side, which are actually value creating, right? These are things that are going to save me money, right? So the first place I might look is, what about those light bulbs? Those incandescent light bulbs, they cost a lot, right? They cost a lot. They have to be replaced all the time. They use a lot of electricity. If I could just replace those light bulbs with maybe some LEDs, I'd spend less money on electricity, have to replace them less often. I'm going to save money, right? That's the first place most people look. Okay, and so that's a legitimate thing, right? So you're going to start doing that. You're going to do, maybe there's another process that you're doing where you're spending a lot of money on, maybe transportation of something that you could get locally. Maybe that's going to save you money, right? If you start looking at some of these things. A lot of companies are at a point where they've already sort of chipped away at these more value creating options. And they're going to kind of move to the right along this. This is called a marginal abatement curve. And this is what your average company is going to do. They're going to start looking at the things that are going to save them money, right? So abatement cost is on the left. This is tons per CO2. So if you're down below the zero, these actions are actually going to save you money. Okay, if you're sort of at the 0 point and the horizontal line, then these actions really, you could kind of take them or leave them. They don't really matter. You might as well do them because they're going to save carbon. And then once you get to the point where your abatement costs are positive, these are actions your company could take that would save carbon, but they're going to cost $1. There's going to be $1 value associated with them, right? $1 per ton. Okay, and so you as a company are going to start looking at these costs really critically. Your CEO is going to be asking you, the operations guy is going to be asking you, I'm not sure I can do this thing. It's going to cost me more money, and the CEO is going to be breathing down my neck because, I don't know if I can. It's going to cost money, and I might lose some profit. My shareholders are going to be mad because my dividends aren't going to be quite as big. Okay, and then you get to the point at the very, very right-hand side where some of these, and especially in these hard to abate industries with things like steel and rubber, right? Batteries, things where you have aluminum, right? In many, many cases, the next least costly action that you and your company could take are going to run you in the hundreds of dollars per ton. Like, you could do this, but it's going to cost $400 a ton that's saved. Okay, and that's going to be pretty costly for your company. It's going to be really hard. So here, this is interesting, right? Because this is where your company really starts to think about trade-offs. And this is where the value of the voluntary carbon market really, really makes itself known. Right? Because if you're in the boardroom and the CEO is asking you, I have a couple options here, right? Like, I could invest in this new technology. My engineering group is going to have to really try to think hard about how to destroy, for example, how to destroy pollution using a whole new technology as opposed to the air pollution control equipment that uses natural gas right now. My air pollution control equipment is required. It's a required part of my plant, right? Right now it runs on natural gas. I can't have air pollution emitted to the atmosphere because my permits for operation demand that I destroy those air pollutants. So I I have two choices for how I destroy them. I could continue to emit natural gas and the CO2 associated, or I could ask my engineering program to create a whole new way of destroying those air pollutants. That's going to cost $500 a ton. Okay, in the boardroom, what do? The CEO says, how much does an offset cost? Right? Because like, that's a whole lot easier than having to, go ahead and like invest in this new technology to destroy the air pollution. Now, along the way, hopefully somebody else is investing in that air pollution. Maybe there's a university that's working on new methods of destroying air pollution, such that the cost eventually will go down quite a bit. And then I can invest in that, right? But in the meantime, it might make more sense for me to spend $50 on an offset than $350 per ton trying to destroy that air pollution in a different way. Okay, so this is the key to what an individual company is trying to do and how an individual CEO is going to make their decisions, and the board. And so let me talk a little bit about investment, because another way that the VCM, or the voluntary carbon market, can participate is it's another place where investment can happen, right? And so again, McKinsey tells us that in order to reach net zero by 2050, we're going to need annual new investment of $3.5 trillion. Let me say that again. Annual investment, that means every single year between now and 2050. That's how much money will need to be invested in order to get to net zero. So, there's a lot of different places where that investment can happen, right? VCM is one of them. The VCM is actually a great way. I'll talk about that in a second, because I get to the VCM section in my next part. But I do want to talk a little bit about this investment, because right now we're at about half that. Okay, we're at about 1.8 trillion. And maybe eventually, I think it's taken some time for us to get ramped up. And so maybe we'll overshoot that. And so on average, we'll be at 3.5 trillion by the time we need to have all that investment. This is pretty good. This isn't bad, right? But also I want you to notice that a lot of that investment is on renewables, right? So this is the electricity grid. Remember, this is the 30% that I talked about before, right? So that other wedge, that yellow wedge, is the manufacturing. That's chemicals, aluminum, steel, batteries, rubber, okay? This is the hard to abate sectors that we're still sort of not really quite there yet. Are you with me so far? Okay. Okay, part 3, the voluntary carbon market. And I'm going to use VCM as short for this. So when I say VCM, you guys think voluntary carbon market, okay? That's what this is. So we're going to talk about what is a credit, how do we create projects, what kind of projects are there, and then like how do we use offsets in a net zero aligned way as a company. So remember I talked about companies trying to set their own science-based targets, meet them using incremental investments in tech, and sort of maybe struggling to sometimes be able to meet those investments or meet those targets using existing available affordable technology. Okay. So a carbon credit, and this comes from a paper that was just published in December of last year. It's basically like, think of it like a financial instrument, okay? There's a company, and that company could be any company. It could be a company that's developing a project in a nature-based system. It could be a company doing work in a tropical forest, right? But that company is taking some action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or cause those emissions to be reduced. And the buyer, right? The buyer is giving the seller money, and then the buyer gets to take credit for the emissions reduction. Okay? A key part of this, what makes this work, you guys, the atmosphere doesn't care. Okay? The atmosphere does not care where that reduction takes place. It really doesn't. It doesn't matter, right? Whether somebody is reducing their emissions in South Africa or South Carolina, it literally doesn't matter. We're still reducing a ton of emissions, right? It has to be an actual ton, okay? But it doesn't matter where that ton is happening. It doesn't matter who's doing the reduction, right? If we want impact, what we should be doing is directing those dollars where it will do the most good, okay? And in many cases, that happens to be doing projects that might not otherwise get investment. And in many cases, that is investment in places like where the emissions are going up, like India and China, okay? Or other places where there might be disadvantage, where it's hard for companies and countries to get concessionary capital, right? Where it's hard to invest because traditional banks might not want to invest in emissions reductions projects in some of these areas in the global south, right? Where the need, frankly, is the greatest. Okay, so getting to net zero, here's the other piece about it, is going to require carbon markets. Remember, this is sort of a net zero trajectory. You could think of this as a net zero trajectory for one company or one country. I guess this has to be a country or globally because it's a cumulative carbon budget. But these blue wedges are the removals. Okay, so the black wedges are above the black bars. These are the emissions. In order to balance, when we get to net zero, we're going to need the removals. Okay, so the reason we're going to need carbon markets, there are lots of reasons we're going to need carbon markets, and a lot of them have to do with the flexibility I mentioned and the investment in the global south. But one other important reason, if you don't believe all those other reasons, you do need to understand that the only place we have removals right now is in the VCM. So if you're a company and you want some carbon removals, unless you're going to be like Occidental Petroleum and just buy a carbon removal company, you actually need to invest in credits that are right now only offered on the voluntary carbon market. Okay, so how does a carbon project work? Let's see. Let's take the best known example is probably, and the one that has been in the news the most, is probably reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, or REDD+, right? So I'm sure you've seen these in the news. This is a project where, where our baseline rate of deforestation is pretty high. Right, remember, 15% of global emissions today are resulting from land conversion, primarily in the tropics. Okay, so in order to get to net zero, we got to stop cutting the forest down. And these REDD+ projects are one way to incentivize people to invest in alternative uses of forest or of their own, alternative sort of lifestyles for themselves, so that no longer will they need, or no longer will the forest need to be cut down for them to sort of maintain the same lifestyle. So this is a tropical deforestation project. Okay, so you are a project developer. You say, this is my mission. I want to reduce deforestation in this area that I can define. So I have my project area. I'm going to establish, I'm going to define what I think the baseline rate of deforestation was in this area over time. Maybe that rate is, we think we're going to lose 3 or 4%. Let's just call it 3%. We think we're going to lose 3% of that forest every year from now for the next 30 years. So that's my baseline rate of deforestation. But I think if I can intervene in this area and potentially build a training center maybe for the people who live there, who want, I've worked closely with them, and I know that what they want is some facility that will help them learn an alternative trade so that they don't need to cut down forest for timber. Okay, so this is what they want. And in return, they are going to protect the forest, and it's only going to be cut down at a rate of 1.5% a year, right? So we're going to reduce the deforestation rate from 3% to 1.5% a year. And then the delta, the margin, is going to be the forest savings that I get, right? So that is the carbon credits from this REDD+ project are basically going to be the margin between 1.5% and 3%. Boom, bingo. I've saved this much forest, okay? So that is a REDD+ project. I, as a developer, now I've established my baseline. I'm going to go now and I'm going to submit the paperwork for this project to what's called a registry. I'm going to get it audited by a third-party auditor. And then once it's on the registry, I can sell those credits, right? And the credit's basically 1 ton for each ton of carbon that was not lost when forest was converted, okay? So that's how these carbon projects work. A few key concepts, right? I talked about baseline. The baseline has to be accurate. It has to be a realistic view of how much carbon would have been lost in the event this project did not take place. That's the first thing. That's a lot of projects lately have been opposed on those grounds, right? Baseline has been gamified by the developers. So baseline has to be correct. The project has to be additional. What does that mean? Right? It means, and I'm not going to ask them, no call and response. All of a sudden I was worried somebody was going to say something. It means that the additionality basically means if this project did not take place, right, would this action have taken place anyway? In other words, were these people going to save this forest if I didn't have this training facility? And the answer is it ought to be no, right? And so that means that the project was additional, right? In other words, it is happening, it is over and above what would have happened under regular conditions. It has to be additional. The funding has to be the reason the reason the intervention took place, okay? It should be permanent, or there should be a low risk of reversal, or reversal should be somehow accounted for, right? Reversal is when, let's say, in a forest planting project, a reversal would be where there's a fire and the whole thing goes up in smoke, so the carbon is no longer stored. That's a reversal. That's bad, and we have to make sure we have provisions in place to handle it. Leakage, right? That's if your project takes place here, you have to make sure that you're not just, and you're saving the forest here, you got to make sure that we're not just cutting down forest somewhere else, right? This project activity hasn't like leaked to an adjacent jurisdiction. That's going to be a problem. Another aspect of quality is co-benefits, right? Are we protecting biodiversity at the same time we're protecting forests? That's always a good thing, right? Are we protecting water? Are we improving the quality of life for the people who live in this area, right? That is another co-benefit. Double counting, right? We got to make sure that that one company that buys these credits, that those credits can't then be used again by another company, right? Because if we've done that, then we actually haven't reduced emissions by the second company. We got to make sure that there's no double counting, right? And the way we do that is once the credits are used by one company, we retire them. We basically erase them from the registry so that nobody else can use them. That's how we deal with double counting. And then the other thing is accounting accuracy. That kind of relates to the baseline. Are we doing a good job of quantifying the carbon in this area? Are we in an industrial emissions project? Are we actually accounting for all of the different life cycle emissions that might be associated with this project? That's a completeness. Okay, so these are all really important concepts around making sure that the carbon project is high quality. How much does a credit cost today? Right now, not much, actually, right? And this relates to the marginal abatement curve I showed you before, right? So right now the costs are low. They're probably, I would say, between $5 and $20, sometimes less, for offsets, for credits on the market, on the voluntary carbon market today, which is amazing when you think about it, because like in the EU ETS, carbon is worth like between 100 and 150 euros, which is amazing. So it's super cheap on the VCM, but not for long, right? This is from Bloomberg, and they're imagining that carbon prices will go up to, $200 by 2040 and a little higher by 2050. So they're low now, but they're likely to keep going up as demand goes up. So what kind of projects do we have in the market today? Okay, the market's been around. The first carbon project was established in 1988. And we started with like the clean development mechanism was established by the Kyoto Protocol in 1992. And a lot of renewable projects were established then, right? So in the old CDM, we were replacing fossil fuel electricity with solar and wind. And people got credit for that because it was additional at that time, right? Well, things have changed. And it's no longer additional in many jurisdictions to put in new solar and wind. Why? Because it's cheaper, right? It's actually cheaper to put in solar and wind today in many jurisdictions than it would be to put in new fossil, whether that's gas or coal. Okay, and so you really can't put in a renewable project today that's additional. Those projects are not viewed as high quality anymore the way they were, 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. Actually, 30 years ago in 1992. But so that's that wedge, the pie on the right. These are all the issued credits since its inception. Most of these have been retired now, so we're not actually looking at, old. It would be hard to find an old renewable credit today in the market just because they've all been issued and retired and used. But but the red plus does exist. That's that lower green wedge. And there's some carbon capture and storage, not much, that tiny little green wedge on the left. That's the CCS, right? Important to know, like the market right now is less than like 2% removals. So most of the carbon credits in the market today are these avoided emissions projects. An avoided emission project is basically, I was going to emit this thing, but I intervened and I'm not going to emit it. I'm not going to emit it, right? A great example is like an industrial credit. There's like if you look at the dashboard in your car, that's got to be like, that's a piece of plastic in most cases, and they have to use like a foam blowing agent to shape that piece of plastic into the thing that it is when it goes into your car. Okay, and some of the foam blowing agents they can use have really high global warming potential and are pretty bad for the environment. But for a little bit more money, you can invest in a low emitting foam blowing agent and substitute that foam blowing agent and still make the same dashboard insert for your car, right? And so you can get, as a company that does that, you can actually get a carbon credit or a series of carbon credits for making that substitution, right? Because that is actually an additional, you wouldn't do that, but for the existence of this carbon project money, right? So that's a great example of an avoided emission. Okay, we were going to emit this thing and we don't, so it's avoided. How much more are we going until?
45.
45. Okay, so I'm going to skip over this one. This is pretty complicated. This is when you go back and get super excited about the voluntary carbon market, I want you to look at the Oxford offsetting principles, because it's sort of how companies can look to use net zero aligned principles to do their offsetting. That's what this is. I encourage you to do that. I think the link is right there. It was released last week. Because what I want to do is talk a little bit in my last 3 minutes about what we're doing in the VCM to improve its reputation and its quality, okay? Remember I said quality is important, but the atmosphere really doesn't care where the emissions take place. The VCM is a fantastic mechanism to get money to the places where it's needed the most and to create investments where those investments are needed and to create flexibility for companies so that we can scale climate impact. Okay, it has been under siege, right? You might have seen John Oliver, you might have seen this article in the New Yorker, you might have seen, The Guardian and Bloomberg. Okay, so there's tons of media narrative that's negative about the market. All of that relates to, and admittedly, right, VCM 1.0 is sort of the Kyoto Protocol version of the voluntary carbon market. There were problems, right? Let's be honest. There were methods that probably were a little too loose and resulted in credits that maybe were not quite worth a whole ton, right? And we need to be honest about that. We need to be upfront about that. We can't sort of shove that under the rug, because we want to move to VCM 2.0, where we have a more trustworthy, quality, high integrity market. And that's what's happening now in 2024. And the initiatives that are, this is an important and interesting time for the markets, an inflection point this year, 2024, because we have initiatives on both the supply side and the demand side that are helping the market to shore up its reputation and to improve its actual quality, right? On the supply side, we have the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, the ICVCM, right? And it is creating what's called the Core Carbon Principles, which is basically a floor for what counts, what's good enough, what counts as quality in the carbon market, right? And they are those, it takes time. They're using a very deliberate, intentional, stakeholder-driven, stakeholder-led approach to figuring out what, to sort of defining the parameters for good in the carbon market, and that's fantastic. it's underway, right? It's a work in progress. The other thing that's happening, and so that's the ICVCM. On the demand side, another acronym, the VCMI, or the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, okay, which is another ICVCM sort of related acronym, VCMI. So what they're doing is creating a system for companies, right? So on the supply side, remember, that's for the developers to figure out how can they create a credit that's really worth a ton. That's on the supply side. The demand side is for companies to say, how can I use credits and make claims in a way that is credible, that my customers and my stakeholders in the SEC and all of my governments are going to actually support and believe, right? So that people that I care about will trust what I'm doing and that I'm doing the right thing, okay? And part of that process is to use high quality offsets that are endorsed by the ICVCM, which is, again, the Supply Side Quality Initiative. So these are all sort of underway and super optimistic about the movement, right, from VCM 1.0 to VCM 2.0. And Rubicon is working really hard to create products for companies that are consistent with the new quality initiatives in the VCM 2.0. And this is I'm not, again, I'm over time, so I'm not going to try to go through all of this. But again, in your free time, when you are curious, take a look, VCM 1.0 and VCM 2.0. And so that is, we did not have time to get to the Rubicon stuff, but that's okay. And I will stop there. Yeah, thank you.
Hey, per usual, we have the next, you just really wanted to embarrass her, didn't you?
All right, okay, we'll go back.
We have between about 20 plus minutes or so for questions. So we'll start. I'm gonna see hands held high. Okay. Jeremy, we'll take this side. Keep your hands up, Okay, we'll start 1, 2, 3. Now 1, 2, 3, 4 on this side. You'll do your 4. Why don't we start here, please?
Hi, thank you very much for this detailed presentation about the carbon market. And as you mentioned, it's kind of like a challenge right now to have a high quality carbon accounting. And I wonder, do you think the current understanding of the carbon emission and in general the science field is enough for us to have maybe improvement or just great precision in the accounting side? And also, is there any existing industrial or prevalent standard for this area right now?
So the question is do we know enough, right, to, do you mean, do companies know enough about their emissions to really do a good job? Or is it more, are we confident that the quality will improve?
Probably both sides, both science, academia, and companies, do they understand enough to have a precise accounting of carbon? Because I know one of our ecology professor mentioned that at least for methane and carbon budgeting, there's still a dispute or kind of disagreement between how much we should put for each section. So there's still some I would say uncertainty and imprecision under debate. So that I wonder how is that demonstrated in the carbon accounting, especially for the carbon market right now?
So at the corporate level, remember I mentioned that there's now rules on disclosure for scope 1 and scope 2, and increasingly for scope 3. I would say companies can do a pretty good job of estimating. So for those of you who don't know, the greenhouse gas protocol is the way that companies, it's sort of a internationally accepted method for how companies account for their own emissions, right? And so scope 1 is the emissions associated with a company's internal operations, right? So this is like a manufacturing firm, like the one I talked about, that's using natural gas for the emissions control equipment. That's a scope 1 emission, right? Scope 2 emissions are purchased electricity, right? So arguably, your decision to use electricity is your own decision as your company, but you don't get to decide the grid, right? You don't get to decide as a company. You don't control what the proportion of renewable electricity is on the grid where you're located, right? So that's scope 2. Scope 3 is emissions outside your operational control, but that you nevertheless are influencing. A great example of that is air travel, right? So my decision to take a trip is my decision alone as a company. I do that, but I don't control the emissions from that airplane, right? Similarly, like products in use, right? So for an oil company, the products in use, right? So the oil company makes the oil, right? But arguably, they don't make the decision to burn the oil, right? It's the engine in which that an oil is burned, right? So that's the products in use. That's a scope 3 emission for that oil company. Scope 3 is notoriously hard to measure, very difficult. It's also often the largest source of emissions for a company. So I'm sure there's arguments about, we don't know, it's hard to know, it's uncertain, et cetera, et cetera. My own view is, I don't care, right? I don't care how hard it is. Figure it out, right? Do your best. If you're within 50%, fine, right? The methods will get better and you'll get better at disclosing them. But don't sort of use that as a reason not to act, right? That's my own lens on that. And I do think I guess I feel similarly about the carbon market, right? Let's have impact. Let's just get going, right? Let's stop arguing about how good all the methods are and, spending 80% of the effort to get the last 10% of the precision. Let's just do it, right? Let's just get it done. Let's just have the impact. do we really need to know if it's 95% or 100%? Like, isn't it still better than 0? That's kind of where I am.
Thank you so much for, again, taking the time to mention. My question was, I know there are a lot of car companies, for example, Honda did this in California, right, where they'll release an electric variant and a limited production run of the model they already have. And I don't know if that's to kind of avoid having to go through the full cost of producing an entirely new platform. And so my question was what are the environmental versus corporate benefits of doing something like that? I mean, this is in the US, I'm thinking of many other projects, other companies doing that are similar to that. And so what are these projects having any measurable benefits or any more of a good one?
Right.
What would you say?
So, yeah, super interesting. I'm not sure your microphone is on, but I'll try to restate your question. And so tell me if I got it right. I think what you talked about a company maybe in the California market is releasing a limited edition of something it already makes, but in an EV version.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's they do that, and they also have certain states where they have to do it, Colorado's another.
Right.
And it's
Right.
various states.
Yeah, and so the question is is that legit? Is it helping? Are there other cases, right? Why would a company do that? So this is an interesting example where the state of California is super interesting, right? Because they tend to, on climate stuff especially, they were the first to establish or among the first, I'm sure they might not have been the first, but they were among the first to establish a real live cap and trade program internally. So they have their own cap and trade program for their state, which is super forward looking and very progressive. They also had, I think my guess is, if I'm Honda or Chevrolet or whomever, and I'm trying to do business in California, I know that California actually has pretty stringent fuel economy standards. And so because the fuel economy standards are basically what the fleet average is, right? I know that if I can release an EV version of something that people are already familiar with, and get people using that EV version in California, then I can drive down the average fuel economy of my whole fleet and do a better job of meeting California's standard, right? So as a company, as Honda or Chevrolet, that's a great strategy for me. And why would I introduce a model that looks like something else? Well, people already know the other thing, right? People are notoriously bad at changing. right? So if I already have like good acceptance of my Civic, why wouldn't I release an electronic Civic that people know what it looks like, and I don't have to change all the chassis and everything, do all the re-engineering to make it look different, right? People are going to accept it anyway. I think that's a great strategy. And I think, a lot of companies are probably going to follow suit. And if they do it in other states, probably for the exact same reason. And eventually maybe we'll have a more, even in a state where the fuel economy standards have not been so heavily regulated, we'll have more EVs everywhere.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. I just had a quick question in terms of carbon credits accounting, especially when we're considering the startup landscape. So this past summer, I actually worked in a VC that was looking to invest in carbon credit startups. And a problem I noticed was between all the startups, like they would all have very similar offerings, but there seemed to be a trade-off between accuracy and efficiency, especially in regards to scope 3 emissions. So kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on how to kind of see like what type of company actually is doing good work in terms of offering like these carbon credit accounting platforms, and how to differentiate like a good company, especially within this like very oversaturated landscape right now.
So it's funny because where I thought you were going to go was that these are companies that are trying to develop new credit types. No,
they're like all doing the same like carbon credit accounting with like the GHG protocol and trying to follow the same ones. But there were companies like between those who use like ERP systems, like connected it to ERPs and like imported company data into it to calculate carbon credits, versus companies who would allow for actual employees of their clients to input data manually. And just wanted to kind of hear your thoughts on, how accurate should these records be, because the more accurate, the more like human labor required, and I guess the less you can capture within that time, especially large corporations.
I mean, it's the same question, right? It's similar. It's right now, because scope 3 is hard. And I mean, when you think about that system, right, it makes sense, right? If everybody accounted for their scope 1 and 2, we wouldn't need scope 3. Right? If you think about that, right? Because my scope 3, if we think about air travel, my scope 3 is Delta Airlines scope 1, right? So like, if everybody accounted for all aspects of their scopes 1 and 2, scope 3 is a way to try to internalize all of that weird external stuff that's happening in other countries or outside your borders or in other places where people aren't being held accountable or holding this, right? So there's a lot of sort of squishiness, right? So the way people are doing scope 3 now is by, like you're saying, looking at their spend in their ERP system, like a company that has like they're using a big giant accounting system to manage their accounting money data, right? So they'll look at like what's the spend in various categories, and they'll just kind of map that spend to like emissions per dollar spent, right? It's very imprecise. It's incredibly imprecise. It's really, really hard. Another way to do it is to demand that your suppliers submit to you their scope 1 and scope 2 data. Depending on how big your company is, that is a gigantic load, a gigantic lift. I've heard of other big companies like trying to externalize to hold their suppliers accountable for their suppliers' emissions, and basically say, we won't work with you as a supplier unless you've disclosed your scope 1 and 2 emissions, and you've made an effort, and you have a net zero target, and you're making an effort to reduce those emissions. And by the way, I'll sell you some carbon credits if you're having trouble meeting it, right? As a supplier of a big company. There's different ways. There's different ways to do it. I don't think there's any one right way. But I'm not sure we're going to get past the scope 3 accuracy issues, if I'm honest, because it's a mess. It's a mess. I think everybody should disclose scope 1 and 2. We wouldn't have this problem.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking today. I just wanted to ask, because I am interested, if you could briefly just talk on how does Rubicon carbon fit in, and just like really briefly, because I know you didn't get to touch on it.
Oh, wow. Okay. I might use a slide if you don't mind. If That's okay. Thank you for asking. So we are a company we were just started about a year and a half ago in November of 22. We're incubated by a big private equity firm called TPG under their Rise Climate portfolio, which has about $7.5 billion under management. We're really trying to transform the voluntary carbon market, right? Through looking at scale, confidence, and innovation. And we do that through making investments in quality carbon projects, as well as packaging the credits that we own into portfolios of diversified projects, right? So we invest in promising removal and avoidance projects. And we can do that either alone or with partners. And those projects, right, remember I said a developer sort of invests in a project up front that then will yield a stream of credits for 30, 40, 50 years down the road. And then we sort of package together these RCTs, or Rubicon carbon tons, and imagine them, it's like a portfolio. If you know, it's not regulated like an ETF, but think of it like an ETF, right? So one Rubicon carbon ton is like a share in this portfolio, right? So it's a diversified set of projects, and so you can manage risk in the way a financial system might manage risk. Diversification is how you're always going to manage your risk, especially in an ETF. That's the idea. And so we curate, manage, and commercialize those RCTs, which are these risk-adjusted portfolios. And each RCT is like a share in that portfolio. And then we enable clients to actually build their own portfolios from the projects that we own, and they can choose to risk adjust those portfolios or not, depending on what their tolerance is for risk and what their budget is. And that's how we do it. So yeah, so this is Rubicon carbon ton, and here's the different kinds of portfolios that we have. So happy to talk to you more.
I was just wondering, because I know a lot of like you mentioned electrifying everything as a possible solution. I know a lot of those will have environmental impacts elsewhere in the world. And I was wondering if the carbon offsets that are getting measured are taking into account, like, for instance, electric car batteries require lithium, which has like a pretty high environmental impact. Does that get taken into account?
Yeah, that the overall. So I'm just talking about carbon. Yeah, but it sounds like what you're asking is, what is the overall environmental impact of all of the sort of interventions and management options that we're undertaking today? With batteries being a great example. I actually think I talked to some folks who are investors in battery tech, and there are new interesting ways of making batteries that are actually using fewer rare earth minerals, which I think is pretty exciting and encouraging. But what I'm talking about is definitely on the carbon side. And we probably need to do a better job of internalizing those other externalities that you're talking about.
I just have a quick question on what your opinion is on the moral or ethical arguments against carbon offsets, saying that wealthy corporations are just paying others to forgive their pollution, or are just paying like off their debt but aren't going to change their ways in the long run.
I mean, good question, right? And that's one of the major arguments about the voluntary carbon market. What I would say is, I would reiterate, right, what I said, which is many of the interventions and sort of investments that need to be made. Remember, I said $3.5 trillion annually. Many of those investments need to happen in the regions where currently emissions are going up the most, right? And those are the places where capital is least available right? And where investment is most difficult and least likely, right? And that's probably why, in many cases, those emissions continue to rise. The VCM, in my view, is a fantastic way to funnel investment where it's most needed, right? From frankly, the wealthy corporations in the global north to the sort of places in the global south where this investment is most badly needed. That's one thing. And the second thing is, a lot of people are saying, the offset, I don't want the oil and gas companies, for example, to have access to the offset market because I think they're just evil and bad operators and they're, and I don't want companies to just be able to sort of buy their way out of internally decarbonizing, right? That's one of the most staunch arguments, against the offset market that we hear a lot. I will say the data actually show the opposite, right? The companies that are using offsets today are the ones that are the most ambitious. They're the ones that are already decarbonizing the most. And the companies that are not using offsets are actually not actually taking action as quickly as the ones that are using offsets. So the evidence actually points in the opposite direction. We're not seeing that people are just trying to sort of paper over their emissions and use offsets as a way to buy their way out. That's not happening.
As previously mentioned, companies have been focusing on reduction efforts, but I was wondering, is this just for emissions in the US? Or do they also consider developing countries where they have production facilities? Also, sorry for my voice.
So what you're wondering is if US-based companies are accounting for their locations overseas. Yeah, they are actually. I think in the SEC rules, I think you sort of have to account for, you have to account for all of your if you're a US company, you got to account for all of your locations, right? You don't get to sort of wall some off. Okay, go ahead.
So something that's been sort of talked about a little bit in environmental governance circles in the last couple of years is biodiversity credits. We're just wondering what your thoughts are on those.
Yeah.
They're somewhat similar to carbon credits, although for different reasons.
Yeah. So the question was about biodiversity credits. Sort of where are they in the sort of global discussions, right? A lot of interest right now in biodiversity credits, for sure. Right now, biodiversity is viewed as sort of a co-benefit, right? So when you protect a tropical forest, you're also protecting the biodiversity, right, that exists within that tropical forest and that tropical, the biodiversity depends on that sort of forest system remaining intact. So it's right now a co-benefit. The biodiversity credit would be fantastic if we could figure out what in the world biodiversity means. Right? We don't know right now there is no index generally accepted for biodiversity, right? That would be easily sort of translatable and creditable. People are working on it, right? But it's a work in progress. The other concern that I have is a carbon credit is easily viewable as sort of something that a company can do, and it can be sort of integrated into its operations and its value chain, right? You emit carbon, you compensate for that carbon, right? It's like a 1-for-1. With a biodiversity credit, I'm not quite sure what you'd be compensating for, right? Unless you're explicitly damaging biodiversity and trying to rebuild it, right? Like, I'm not sure what the 1-for-1 would be. On the other hand, there is a market for philanthropic activity by corporations. The drawback with that is philanthropy is the first thing to go when interest rates rise, when times are hard, when profits are low, right? So a philanthropic approach to me is not going to be enough to scale the way we probably need it to scale. So biodiversity, okay, but work to do.
I think we're out of time. So thank you for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you.